Hello friends, in this video we are going to look at checked and unchecked exception in Java. Checked and unchecked exception. Java has two types of exception, and the major categories are error and exception. Under exception we have two types. So the exception are checked and unchecked exception. So before we dig into checked and unchecked exception, let us look at the hierarchy. Then we will learn which one is checked and which one is unchecked exception. So we may hear that the JVM thrown an error and this piece of code thrown some exception. So when we are talking, we are using the word JVM is throwing, or the particular piece of code is throwing the exception. So that's why the infrastructure for throwing an object so that it can be handled in a separate piece of code is kept in a throwable class. So in JDK, the Java SDK, the throwable class acts as a base for all the classes which can be thrown by the code or by JVM. So throwable is the base for all the exception as well as error in Java infrastructure. Error, so there is a class called error, and this class is used to denote the abnormal program condition. That means it is a fatal to the application. So it is fatal to the application. That means we cannot recover from it. Say for example, if an application is saying that out of memory, so we have no chance of quitting from that application. Or if an application is saying some hardware related issue, not able to connect to some of the remote machine. So let us say it is because of a damaged network cable. So we cannot recover from this error, or there is out of memory because of RAM. We cannot recover from that error. Either we have to compile and reduce the memory utilization, or we have to change the RAM hardware to recover from that error. So this is simply a application fatality, so we cannot recover from it. So that's what it denoted by the error. If you see that error is derived from the throwable class, because JVM throws the error when it deducts it. When it deducts, there is no memory to climb from the heap, the free store, then it may throw out of memory error. Right. So this is the error, and the other major category is exception. And in exception we have two subcategory. One is runtime exception, and another one is the normal exception. So runtime exception is a type of unchecked exception. So unchecked here means the compiler will not check that the user handled this exception. Let us say our previous example, so we have kept some mathematical statement, some number divided by 0. So there is a possibility of exception there, but Java compiler won't check that because arithmetic exception is derived from the runtime exception. So the runtime exception is a type of unchecked exception. So because of the arithmetic exception falling under the unchecked exception, Java compiler will never force the developer to handle that exception. So it is up to the developer to know the possibility of exception and enclose that statement within the try and catch block. So there is one more exception called null pointer exception. So when you try to access a object member, it can be either field, data field, or method. Accessing it through an object that is pointing to null will cause the null pointer exception. So the possibility of this in the code is huge. So we know that almost in every method we may end up using an object, calling its method, or accessing its field. So it's not possible to handle all these objects with null pointer exception. So that's why Java doesn't keep this null pointer exception under checked category. So the null pointer exception goes under unchecked exception category. Okay, let us no need to dig into why Java kept this in unchecked exception and why it kept some other classes in checked. So let us don't fall under that. So all we have to know is when an exception is under unchecked exception category, then the Java SDK developer leaving it to us to decide whether we need to handle this exception or not. So whenever you are making a call to API, and make sure that it is throwing any exception, and if that falls under the category, just try to check the possibility of that in your code, then decide whether you need to place a try or catch block to handle that specific exception. So the runtime exception is derived from exception, and so this is one category. And if you derive any other class from this runtime exception, that class automatically falls under the unchecked exception. So here error as well as runtime exception both are unchecked. That means it's up to the developer to know whether they need to place a try catch block. For error, you should not even attempt to handle that with a try catch, because that is a application fatality condition. But here in runtime exception, you may recover from that errors, so you can place a try catch. But it's up to the developer to decide whether they need to handle the particular exception, I mean the unchecked exception. So if they need, they can handle it, otherwise they can leave it. It's up to the developer. So the person who's writing the code knows the criticality of that particular exception and how frequent it can occur, whether they can recover from that error. So all those factors will influence whether they need to handle that exception or not. So there is one more category. Whatever class we derive from exception, those class becomes checked exception. So this includes exception also. So when an exception is a checked exception, Java compiler will check whether the developer is handling it. So if it doesn't handle that exception, then Java compiler will throw an error. So either we have to handle that exception using try catch block, or we have to declare the method that throws a keyword stating that I am not handling the exception. Whoever is calling this method should handle the exception. But the called method also can delegate it to its caller stating I am throwing this exception, I don't want to handle. So that's also the checked exception means Java compiler will always force you to handle that exception. So either you can place a try catch block, or you can mark your method as with a throws class if you don't want to handle that exception. So the exception class as well as all the classes derived from the exception class falls under the checked exception category. So in all our previous examples, we used unchecked exception, we used arithmetic exception. Of course, we doesn't use null pointer exception. We used arithmetic exception, we used array index out of bound exception and string index out of bound exception. So all these exceptions falls under unchecked exception category. So in the coming video series, we will create our own exception that falls under checked exception category. So there we will learn about the checked exception. We will know how we can create our own exception, and you will get more insight towards what is throw and what is throws. There are two different keywords in Java, throw and throws, and you will come to know all this in the coming video series. That's all in this short video series. There is no Eclipse demo here. We will learn about all these categories when we are finishing this SDK course. So we will get used to this exception. So that's why we believe separate Eclipse demo at this stage is not required. That's all in this short video. Thanks for watching. Bye.